I love this conference, not just because this very nice introduction, but just the whole framing of it. The AI, who owns data, is the I think is the cross pin and what it is we really need to be doing, and Silicon Valley is the right place to be having a lot of this conversation. Let me fiddle with technology for a moment. I went to the AI lab at MIT, and I thought we were data starved. Basically, we just didn't have enough data to be able to do our work, and so the idea of just doing all of it didn't seem that hard in that sort of bravado kind of way. And if we take the framing of the last conversation on the AI front, that AI is not sort of right here in terms of machines taking over. I think that's quite true. But I've now been in the corporate world a lot, and I've tried to understand a lot of sort of how that world works. And I would suggest just something provocative, that I'd suggest the first generation AIs are corporations, and that's a useful, if you try to make that bridge. The first era of computers were made out of humans. I would say the first generation of AIs are made out of humans, and they're in corporations that are sort of acting in this sort of very stylized way that's really actually very well replaced with computers and robots. And we're seeing corporations basically design themselves to be replaced by bots, whether it's drones or the Chinese sort of operating as bots until we can replace them as bots. That if we look at it in that way, I find that a fruitful direction. The other is who owns data has a sort of ring to it, because we say, well, we do, it's our data. But if you were to go and say, who owns culture, which is the framing that, a different framing of a slightly different problem by Larry Lessig, you come away with kind of something different. At MIT, when I was there, well, in 1976, the Copyright Act in the United States was flipped, such from an opt-in to an opt-out. It used to be when I grew up, you have to go and put a little C on things and send a copy to the Library of Congress. Otherwise, you didn't get copyright. It was a small group of people that got copyright. Almost everything was not in copyright. Didn't necessarily mean that it's completely available for free, but it's not in copyright. In 1976, everything became copyrighted. In fact, there was no provision to not have it be in copyright, which was kind of odd. And one of the first wheels that came off the cart was in software. So there are a lot of us going and building operating system called the list machine operating system, and no one signed the code because that was thought of as arrogant. We were building it together as a commons. And in 76, when so everything is now owned by somebody, MIT said, so if it's owned by somebody, it must be us, MIT, therefore we can sell it. And they sold it to a company called Symbolics. And Richard Stallman, who was working on the list machine operating system, thought this was horrible because he saw the future of if you fork things into a corporation, they'll develop it along and it will die with them. And he tried very hard to go and keep up with the work of this corporation, to keep the open version up with the closed version, and almost worked himself to death. And he basically said, I can't do this. We have to fix this system, so he basically pulled back to make the open source system. And it all came around over ownership. The United States, I think, is an experiment in over ownership. I love the also framing of sort of the American West. What happens if everything is property? Real estate as property, so we take the American West and make it into property. Well, it wasn't governed that way before the Europeans got here, and it was what happened very quickly after that was we carved it up and it turned it over and it blew away, and we have water problems now. It's the property application, when it's overdone, is kind of problematic. Or take property of humans, which we go and say, oh, nobody would want to do that, but we did that for an awfully long time. And now there's this intellectual property idea, which I think is one of the worst combinations of words ever. So I keep going back to the copyright, trademark, and patents. world. So I love the framing of this. I thought I'm not going to be able to talk too much about this sort of the effluent side, but I can talk about some of the... Wait a minute. It looks really good. Huh. Yeah, on my screen, it looks great. Public information in the public service, access to data in the public interest, examples from the Internet Archive. So who am I? Started the Internet Archive most recently as a mechanism of going and building a library. We see ourselves in the tradition of libraries. I like what people carve in stone. It's just sort of one of those things that people want to be remembered. Above the door of the Boston Public Library, it says "Free to All." And this was put there by the robber barons that were, well, not very nice guys. But there's this idea that information has a different role to play than just mining rights or property interests. And so that's the tradition. So being an engineer, I said, okay, if we're going to try to build the Library of Alexandria version 2, to try to put all the published works of humankind within reach of anybody wanting to have access to it, all the books, music, video, web pages, software, everything ever meant to be published, could we make that available to anybody curious enough to want to have access to it? And the answer is, engineering-wise, yes. It's actually not that hard. Then the question is can we get the societal elements, laws, institutional structures to come along? But to be, that classic engineer, you have to scope the problem. So I'm going to do it in media type by media type and sort of say how we're doing on getting there, both sort of institutionally, law-wise, and some of the experiences we've had in trying to bring, say, texts online. If you say, how many are there? The largest library by far is the Library of Congress. It's about 28 million books. A book is about a megabyte. So a megabyte a book is if you had it in Microsoft Word, the words in the book. So the words in the book is about a megabyte, 28 million. 28 million megabytes goes gigabytes, terabytes. 28 terabytes is all of the words of the Library of Congress. That's about 4 hard drives that you can buy in Best Buy for less than a month's rent. You can buy the storage to store all the words in the Library of Congress for a couple $1,000s, which is kind of interesting. So we've gotten someplace. Of course, if you have images of pages, they come quite a bit larger. And we're starting to put these things online in droves, and Google has done it as well, to go and make these things available online. They're also, you can print them back out again, which is, I think, kind of fun. We made a bookmobile with a satellite dish and a printer, binder, cutter, and kids could make their own books. At $1 a book, you can download, print, and bind your own book. So even if you don't have a computer, you can make these things available. We made a couple of them in India as a test. This is the first day in Alexandria, Egypt, an engineer working with a kid on a book. This is the first book this kid has ever owned. We also tried out in rural Uganda, and it all worked. What we really needed was actually the books. So the technology for distributing information is actually ahead of our societal ability to get the materials to them. There are now these Rube Goldberg machines that go and print and bind machines. But really, I think that's going to be it's the screens. And whether it's sort of portables or all sorts of different kinds of things, are ways that we can go and take our vast libraries of books and make them end-user accessible. My favorite is the bottom right, which is a little talking machine. Because we can digitize these, recognize the words, it can talk a little bit like this, but it can read to anybody out loud, as well as translation. So the idea of, would we want to have all our books online? I think the answer is yes. Then there's the question of cost and rights issues. We started working along with, there's a guy in the library, he doesn't look too happy about it. But anyway, they've digitized about 170,000 Arabic books, which is pretty much kind of the published corpus since World War II of Arabic books in Alexandria. We've developed our own scanner. We have scanning centers around the world that are going and digitizing books for the public good. This is in parallel to the Google project. And the Google, and if Google is the Microsoft, we're the Linux. So we're kind of the open guys, so building this set of materials and not having any constraints on its public use. So you can download all of the public domain works if you wanted to. And I'll show a little bit of how we're trying to deal with some of the rights issues. But we've been working with folks. This is actually from the Bancroft Library, this fabulous old Korean books that Korea wanted back. But instead of going and sending the books back and some repatriation, said, why don't we just digitize them and then you can have the digital versions? And that seemed like a win all the way around. And in China and Beijing, working with sciences and technologies. But I was looking for complete collections. And so I've gone around to these different, we digitize a lot of books, but I wanted a complete collection. Could we get a whole language, everything published in a language online? So I went to the Greeks, and they said, yeah, but we're kind of busy imploding. Then there was the Icelandic folks, and they said, yeah, that would be really easy, that would be great. And there's one person, out of 300,000 people, there's one person that's sort of a self-appointed no person, so that sort of brought that down. But we went to Bali, and they said, yes! So the Balinese are about 3 million people on an island that is now being taught Malay in the Indonesian, sort of an Indonesian language, so all the kids are learning a different language than Balinese, and so there's this kind of, what's going to happen to Balinese? And so we said, why don't we digitize everything ever written in Balinese? Well, it turns out and they said yes, and so we worked with these priests and the like to go and do all of this, and it turns out that they don't write on paper, they write on palm leaves. And they're just completely great. So prepared them and gone. And then there was a question of, okay, now that we've gone and digitized all these, how do you read them? It's like, well, priests read them, or they're in other forms of reading, like shadow puppet plays. It was like, wow, okay, this is not what I would have expected. And then so there's other types of performances that are kind of how these works are actually read. But all in all, the first literature of a whole people to go online is the Balinese, which I think is just fabulous, that they're like the leading in the technical era of going and making their culture back accessible to themselves. So a round of applause for the Balinese. Maybe the Greeks, maybe the Icelandic folks, maybe actually, folks in the United States would really want this to happen. But anyway, the Balinese are leading. We've digitizing books at about 1,000 books every day. We've got scanning centers actually located inside libraries, inside the Library of Congress, and the like. So the idea is to bring everybody along and have it start to become online. We now have about 3 million books. We have about a million modern books that are available to the blind and dyslexic for free because we can. And we have a lending library. The Google Books project, by working with these libraries, major libraries, basically tried to build a wall around it and make a monopoly called the Google Books Rights Registry. It's called an extended collective license. It's an extended collective license to go and take the orphans, put them under ownership of an organization that never got the authority to do so, except by this court case. Then the idea is that then that owning corporation would go and allow people to see the out-of-print works. Well, this is just a tremendously bad idea. And it was seen as a monopoly by the Justice Department. It was objected to by the country of Germany and the country of France, which I thought was kind of interesting. It's not the publishers and they're not the libraries of Germany. The country of Germany objected to a class action lawsuit settlement. But we're seeing this idea come back alive by the Registrar of Copyrights. And we'll probably not see the end of this idea that really fundamentally came from these major libraries to go and build a subscription-based library to our old cultural works. So we have a different approach. One is to go and lend books, so act the way we used to act. So basically, instead of thinking that everything is new in the digital world, that we can go and draw forward some of the traditions that we built up over centuries in the library world, in this case, lending. So if you go to openlibrary.org, we've gone and bought some books from publishers, and we've digitized lots of books. and we're lending them. So what does that mean? If you go to this book that we've bought, it was published in 2010, but it's been checked out. So sorry, you have to go and put on your wait list. But if you take this less popular book, digitized by the Boston Public Library from 1994, so there's probably rights issues on it, but it's, you know, not the cutting-edge New York Times bestseller, you can go and borrow this thing and see it, and it's lent by the Boston Public Library through our system. So the idea is one reader at a time seemed to be a good idea, and it's been working. We now have 300,000 books up on the Internet Archive being made available to people for free. And it's just a way of sort of bringing old into the new in a way that's working. So we're not sued out of existence. It's a system that's working, and we'd like to see it go forward as we bring our libraries digital, as opposed to go and have it all owned and controlled by a few major university libraries that would regulate who could see our past heritage that, frankly, from my perspective, should be publicly available for free. So books, we've found a mechanism to try to get through the thicket. So it's not so much in the effluent, but it's in the cultural materials. And how do you go and do that in this digital age? By being a bit creative and analogous times to other materials. Okay, that's books. So the idea of digitizing all books is doable. I'll do music, and I'm going to start moving pretty fast so we can actually have some time for questions. We started with a group of bands that liked to share. So there's the Grateful Dead started a tradition of allowing people to record their concerts and trade them as long as no one made any money. Key, no one made any money. So by collecting everybody else's stuff for the last 20 years at the Internet Archive, the thing I've learned is people don't want to feel like they're being taken advantage of. If they feel like they're being taken advantage of, they'll stop you somehow or another. Through laws, through whatever. They'll just try to stop you. So just pull back from it. Find people that want to share. So we've now have 6,000 bands that have at some level opted in. It's usually like a drummer saying, sure, or whatever. It's a whole lot less than most lawyers would want to have. We have 130,000 concerts. We have everything the Grateful Dead has ever done. So there's a deadhead. So we're kind of popular for this. And this is all around working. We've brought old materials that were available on the internet and these commercial settings, but all these companies go under, right? They don't last very long. So this is a collection of early materials. We're now host to a lot of internet era materials, but we're starting to work backwards with labels to go and digitize LPs and CDs. We're starting to get donations. This is 78 RPM records that we just got donated. We have a lot of donations of LPs. We're starting to get a lot better at CD digitization using volunteers. And there's digitizing LPs at high res. This is an area that's got a lot of lawyers in it. So the whole question of sort of how do you go and bring that published works of music to people, we're probably going to try to find a different approach. One is to make it available to researchers such as Daniel Ellis, who basically said he was stopped. He just couldn't do his work without access to all these materials. And actually he's on leave now from Columbia to work at Google, which I think is really sad, that you basically are a researcher and you can't get access to materials within our universities, so they're going off to places where they can get the materials. But we're running his code over the whole collection to go and make things available. And we're doing on-campus access. How much further can we go? Can we do 30 seconds and point to where it can be sold? We're going to be experimenting to try to get public access to the musical heritage. We've gotten the cost of digitizing music way down, and we have now over 2 million things that have been either uploaded or digitized by us in the audio domain. So books, music are both, I would say, technologically and cost-wise doable, and we're starting to find mechanisms to work through the societal aspects of ownership, if you will. It's not so much in the corporate realm that we don't have libraries anymore that live in a very different ethos, on a different give and take, in a different use case than the commercial sphere tends to think much about. Moving images. most people think of moving images as Hollywood films. Most of this stuff is wrapped in copyright and still being fairly exploited, so that you can still get access through the commercial sphere for a lot of the materials. We're picking up a lot that aren't. So we've digitized and we're hosting about 1,000 sort of Hollywood-type films. We just got a donation of another 400, but mostly we've been concentrating on other types of films, like old materials that were not really meant for the ages, like educational films, government propaganda films, advertisements. This is shots from a social behavior film called Are You Ready for Marriage? I love these things. But they were never really meant for the ages. But we digitized these from the Prelinger archives, and we put them up, and people love them. I'm not quite sure why. They're kind of bizarre, but I think they're used as sort of background. They're free clip art, video clip art for people's projects. I think it's for a visual generation trying to understand the 20th century. These films work better than reading books. I'm sort of from the print era, so reading Dickens or up in Sinclair, right, helped me understand what the past was. I think a lot of folks now are trying to understand what the 20th century was by using moving images, and Hollywood is so filtered. These things are a lot less. And we're starting to do a lot more with home movies. So we've offered free hosting, and people up a storm go and upload things to us. We'd love more. And we're also getting better at digitizing. We're getting better at digitizing VHS tapes. There was a long Mellon study going and saying, are you allowed to do this or not? And it was like, And so he said, let's just do it. And so we just started doing it. And what we did is we just took the VHS tapes, and if it's available for sale as a DVD, we didn't put it up. If it is available, if it isn't, then we put it up. And so we get a lot of exercise videos, or construction videos, or how to use those fly rods and stuff like that. And people, it's again sort of like a lot of people love these things, and we haven't gotten into any trouble on it. We started collecting television in the year 2000. We're now collecting 71 channels, 24 hours a day, DVD quality, from 25 countries: Russian, Chinese, Japanese, Iraqi, Al Jazeera, BBC, and 24 hours a day. We made September 11th, 2001 to September 18th, 2001 available in 2001, so that was 4 years before YouTube. And it was popular and worked pretty well for helping people understand what's going on. But we wanted to get more out there, so we started lending television, which is sort of an odd idea, but it's worked. So we've taken our television news from the United States, made it so you can go and search on something, and you can go and see clips up to a minute, and then you can use it in your blogs. The idea is to help people think critically about television, and I've got kids in high school, so to think critically you need to be able to quote, compare, and contrast. If you can't do that, then you can't think critically. And television just flows over, and it's very difficult to quote it. So if there's no way to do that, then it's no way to really grab a hold on it, and people can just make stuff up, and and they do. So can we go and provide some level of critical thinking? We want everyone to be a Jon Stewart research department. We want everyone to be able to go and say, this is right, this is wrong, or whatever. And so that's been going on, and that's been working within the cultural sphere. In the commercial sphere, they haven't gone after us. So it's sort of trying to stay out of the way and live in parallel with the publishing industry. Don't annoy them, don't get in their way, but get broader public access, preservation, and access to these materials. The Internet Archive, we've gotten it down so that we can digitize a lot very quickly, and we have over 1 million moving images on the Internet Archive. By doing this, we start to attract some attention from people that you're not really all that psyched to get attraction from. So there is this artifact out of the Patriot Act called National Security Letters, where it allowed pretty much anybody in the government to go and ask any organization for information with no court order, no nothing, and one of the stipulations is that a gag order, so you could never tell anybody ever that you ever received this request. You just have to answer. So we got one of these nasty grams from the FBI, and it came to our lawyers, the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Oh, donate to the Alexandria Foundation. And they came and said, Brewster, it's a bad day. You got one of these things. And it's like, oh, okay, well, can we push back? No. Can we get a court order? No. What if we say no? Jail. What can we do? Answer them. Anything else? I said, well, there's only one thing you can do. It's a little risky. You can sue the United States government. So we sued the United States government, and we won. And the reason why I can tell you this is because we didn't want to let them out of this just by going away. We wanted to be able to tell people about this, and we're one of 3 out of hundreds of thousands of these requests that have come out to publicly go and push back on these things. So this is another example, I'd say, of being a library has helped us. Because the idea of reader privacy is really an understood value in the library world. Rounding people up for what it is they've read has a dreadful history. And so we need to basically use some of our understanding of that and bring it forward. And I think we've missed out on that opportunity in telecom and some of the search engines and the effluent that we're going to be talking about through the rest of today. Those things can be used for very, very bad purposes. And if you tell people about this within the circumstance of libraries, they absolutely know what you're talking about. So I think we can bring forward more of our understanding of how to deal with these things from our history than maybe we admit. We're getting better at software. I'm almost done with this. And one thing that we've done is now you can emulate software in a browser. This is really surreal to me. You can go to the archive.org webpage, and you can go to a page that has MS-DOS games, and you click on the game, and it downloads JavaScript, which is an IBM PC emulator. It boots the emulator, runs its proms, and then boots up the floppy, now a virtual floppy, and you're running the program in JavaScript in your browser. It's a little weird, but you're kind of emulating the past in now and bringing it to a generation that turns out to really like computer games. So when we did this, it melted down our servers and made this these dorky old games that people spent way too much time on when they were young. They're now sort of brought back to life, and I recommend it. It's pretty fun. We're probably best known for archiving the World Wide Web. We've been taking a snapshot every 2 months of the full web, every page from every website as best we can get it, every 2 months since 1996. Snapshot, snapshot, snapshot. There are now about 1,000 librarians helping building subject collections to go and try to make sure that we're doing things really very well. This is what Yahoo looked like in the old days, pets.com, and dorky old web design, which we're all sort of guilty of, from sort of the mid-1990s. So you can see evolutions, but also you can see out-of-print web pages. So an average life of a web page is about 100 days before it's changed or deleted. So the best of the web is already off the web statistically. So I think we've got mandates to be able to do this well. There's other interests for this. This is a press release by the President of the United States declaring that combat operations in Iraq have ended, standing on an aircraft carrier. A couple days later, the press release was changed to major combat operations in Iraq have ended. There was no note that they made any change to this. And if this was noticed by one of our users. So the idea of keeping track of what people say. Otherwise, we live in an Orwellian world where you can basically live in a perpetual present and you can change the past. We've made an archived tool, and it's used for things like organizations doing static things as well as group things to try to record Japanese disasters. So there's lots of web pages that have been archived that are no longer on the web, archived, no longer on the web. And it's a lot of people working together to bring collections of web pages back or save them in time. we're getting better at rare books and letters, and basically it's all photography, and it's trying to work through the rights issues, again, just trying to make it so that people aren't mad at you, and in fact are pleased about it, and it will happen much more. And I find the ownership structure is really not a very helpful metaphor for a lot of the things that we're doing. Next up, personal digital archives. How do we deal with this now that we're spreading ourselves all over the place? Okay, so how do you preserve this stuff? If we're trying to build the Library of Alexandria version 2, probably the Library of Alexandria version 1 is probably best known for burning, right? For not being here anymore. So it's so far gone. So if we're going to learn from that, don't have more than one copy. So when we built the Library of Alexandria, we said, why don't we give them back a copy? And so we basically, there's now a partial copy of the Internet Archive in Alexandria, Egypt, and in Amsterdam. And this is what it looks like here in the United States. We put it in a shipping container for a while. The Wayback Machine was in a shipping container. Oh, so if you want to know how big is the web, you have to ask me.
How big is the web?
How big? It's 20 feet by 8 feet by 8 feet. And it can sit outside, and it can answer questions at 5,000 per second. And that's what sort of the Wayback Machine in 2009 looked like. It was about 3 petabytes. Now we've got about 10 petabytes of the web archived, and total petabytes of about 20 petabytes that are archived, and we have these beautiful machines. We're starting to get a bit better at physical materials because libraries are starting to throw things out. So we thought we should really get better at that. So now we have a lot of donations of physical materials in Richmond, California. We're trying to do things like free wireless, so you actually own the connections to the internet. We want the internet to actually be owned by the people that are using the internet as opposed to rented or used from telcos. So every time we get a building, we put things up and give free Wi-Fi away. We're best at Richmond because San Francisco's got all sorts of restrictions, but Richmond is eager. Talked about just a moment ago, we're doing things in open source housing, if you will, which is can we go and transition buildings to be debt-free? If you make them debt-free, then the underlying costs are 1/3 of market-based rent. At 1/3 of market-based rent, and it doesn't fluctuate as much, we can basically sustain public entities like the Internet Archive over the long haul. Building a credit union to try to get around the banks. And working on Bitcoin because it's an innately distributed environment and trying to support all of that, so we optionally pay our employees in Bitcoins. We can do a sushi place that's Bitcoins. Anyway, it's completely fun. But in closing, so universal access to all knowledge. So who owns data? We do. It is ours. It is us is sort of another way of looking at it. So I think moving away from the property idea and thinking about it as us. And does anybody own us? Maybe we're using the wrong metaphor in some of these characteristics. I think it could be one of the greatest achievements of humankind. I think it could be up there with the Library of Alexandria, Man on the Moon, that type of endeavor. It's a sort of an opportunity to try to make the published works of humankind back available. The flip side, of course, is all the privacy things that we're going to be talking about more, which is all woven in. But I think if we go at this with a less exploitative idea, more open idea, more public entities that are doing infrastructure, that there's a broader way of trying to find out what's right and wrong than some of the structures that we're kind of grafting on our data into existing corporate things. Thank you very much. Do I have time for any? Do I have time for any questions? Did I blow it? Did I blow it? Oops.
Great talk and great achievement. But I wanted to ask you the question: do you see some circumstances where private ownership of data will ever be justified?
The private ownership of data will ever be justified?
Yes.
Yes, I just don't know quite what property means in this exact, but having control over your own self so you don't feel like it's just creepy every time you walk out the door into a public street with, in London where there's just cameras everywhere. Or Mary Minow, who's a lawyer in the library field, said, if what you read is watched, you'll watch what you read. Which I think is just a nice way of, I think we need to build technologies that are better. And one of the things that we're trying to explore at the Internet Archive with some others is how do you build a distributed web that has reader privacy built into it? The visitors to WikiLeaks were spied on by GCHQ, the intelligence guys in Britain, and turned over to the NSA. And the NSA went, even if they're American, said, oh, well, they're persons of interest. We can go and target these people just because they've visited the site WikiLeaks. That's creepy. And so I think we're in a point that we've got to go and build some of these technologies, not necessarily in some of the corporate entities that are trying to find endless ways to exploit. So how to get there? I think there's a bunch of technological ways. There might be legal ways. But that's the subject of today.
Hi, I'm Animesh Pathak from INRIA in Paris. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And I especially liked the example where the professor from Columbia had to leave his university and join a company to get access to data that he was.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's quite direct line, but it's at least part of it.
Correlation, not causation, perhaps. But I was curious to know if the Internet Archive is in touch with initiatives to publicly make available data from test beds. Because as computer scientists, often we want data to prove our theories, not just data about text, but data about mobility traces from people. If we want to prove whether my GPS records can be used to figure out exactly where I went and beyond and stuff like that. Are you working with those organizations as well?
We're doing some things in the sort of data sets. And something I've also learned is nothing's ever very simple. So people say, well, just put things up that are public. It's like, well, how public? And for what uses? I mean, even the web collection, if you were to strafe our web collection, you'd find a lot of email addresses and build a spam bot that's even better than exists, which would be kind of dreadful. So there's just a lot more shades of gray. Maybe I'm just growing old and gray, but it doesn't seem like the sharp distinctions are very good. So when we get some of these collections, they're sort of like, who are you to be able to have access to these things? Because you can probably do things that would make it such that the people's data wouldn't be happy about it. And it's tough. But yes, we're attempting to be a repository for data sets in the researcher domain in the same sense that there are repositories for journal articles. What do you do with all the backing data? And we're storing a bunch of this. One more?
One more question?
You.
Well, it's a nice statement that you have universal access to more knowledge, but like you said, we have the technology, but we don't necessarily have the human resources to digitize everything.
Oh, we do.
So how in your project, how do you decide who sets the priorities?
Oh, anybody that's enthusiastic enough to either pay for it or do it, does it. And we absolutely do have the resources to it. It's about $100 million to go from where we are now, $100 million, to go from where we are now to having a Boston Public Library or a Princeton or a Yale completely online. $100 million. $100 million is sort of the cost of a refurb of one of these buildings, right? So that's the sort of cost to do it. So I think actually we do have the societal interest and people will use it.
Great. Those are all good segues into the next panel where we'll be